So we have Wrinberg to tell us about mechanism design in different blockchain protocols.
Awesome, thank you. So I told Clara when I was preparing for this talk, so I have like 5 hours worth of slides, and I'm happy to kind of like pick and choose. Yeah. So I'm happy to kind of be guided by what interest is here. So feel free to, so maybe I'll ask before going into some stuff whether it's background that's helpful or background you guys already have. And, like if there's some topics you want to hear more on, I'm happy to do more technical stuff, more what does this mean stuff or whatever, but just let me know. Okay, so it's possible that I'll talk about several joint works, but these are the possibilities. So, okay, so the high-level outline. So, like maybe 6 years ago when I was like first giving talks like this, I feel like this was like a new concept for some people. What's on this slide, it may be kind of like more mainstream now, but just in case I want to share. So like the way that I look at blockchain protocols is I really look at them at what like my community calls mechanisms, which is that it's not just that like you have a protocol, people follow the protocol, what happens, that you really look at sort of like it provides actions that people in the system can take. And what they do is they specify payments that say sort of like based on the profile of actions that everyone's taking, how much payment does everyone actually get? And then on top of that, they specify desired behavior that maybe I would call the protocol. And so kind of like my thing, so like what I do is I try and look at, well, like, what are people incentivized to do in the games that are set up by this? And, so this is, again, maybe not like a new view, so let me skip this. And so what I'm going to do is, again, pending interest, overview like several different models. Some are closer to Bitcoin and proof of work. Others, if there's interest, is, for like some of the newer proof of stake stuff. But again, wherever there's interest, I'll go. So for everything, I have prepared kind of like formal statements and models and intuition for like why manipulation is profitable in those domains. And if desired, I either have slides somewhere with deeper math or can go into that if there's interest, or just like pause and discuss like, why is the model right or is the model right or stuff like that. Okay, so this slide is maybe for this group, maybe like my first real intro slide. So this is like the lens that I like to use to look at incentives and consensus protocols. So in all cases, all of the theorems or result will sound something like this, that it'll say for this protocol, as long as no player has at least X% of the computation, stake, whatever, then it's a Nash equilibrium for everyone to follow the protocol. So that's kind of like the desirable property. And then you can sit and say like, what do I think of, what do I think of X? Is that a big number, a small number, whatever? And in some cases, so this is the lens I use. I like separating between the first case and the second case that isn't up yet. So in some cases, this is some number bigger than 0, and it's less than 50. Okay, but but it's still some large number. And so I would say, like, for example, like 32.9% is less than 50, and like that was surprising when people first learned it. It's still a pretty big number, and so like I don't know that. I don't know, maybe you guys know better, but I don't know that sort of like, at least from a fundamental or theoretical level, that fussing about 33 versus 50 is huge, but it's still a very big number. That seems safe to me. And so for all of these results, we're about like understanding, like, I think it's really fun to nail down what's the right number, but I think, like I would like to know what this is, but maybe, for like, what does it mean in practice? Maybe not that important. In some cases, like X is 0. And so this to me feels very different. So in the first case, what this means is that, like, yeah, if you have a good understanding of, that there's no sufficiently large players, you have a good understanding of maybe the network conditions, that it's reasonable to say that there's maybe only a few players you need to watch out for, maybe there's none. In the bottom case, this feels very different to me, that this feels that, like, look, anyone, no matter how small they are, they can be like an individual player who just has like 1% or less of the stake. If they're in a situation where it's politically safe for them to manipulate it and profit, then there's something they can do.
Is that the paper where the block subsidy has gone away and the transaction
This one,
fees,
correct.
but the blocks are unlimited size?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. And then and then the top two are proof of stake.
And 32.9% is selfish mining.
So this is slightly better than selfish mining. So there was a follow-up paper in 20. So the selfish mining is 33. And also I sort of consider the real one is like when you have the worst network conditions. So this is from a miner who will like always lose all ties if they, if there's two longest chains. This follow-up paper of Saperstein, Samplinsky, and Zohar showed a slightly better strategy that works for 32.9.
Right.
Okay, so anyway, so this is the lens I like to use. So all the results will have this phrasing, and then if you ask me what do I think is the most important distinction, I think it's like 0 versus not 0. Okay, so
And my longest chain means most working.
yes, correct. Yeah, sorry. So Rainer asked if I could comment on the common assumption about the utility function, on-chain reward in nominal terms. Yes, okay, great. So I will say something quick and then I will get to that too. So the common assumption we make, so everything is denominated in the currency itself. So when I say that on these slides, if I say something is profitable, it's profitable because it's getting you more Bitcoin or more ETH or whatever. And everything is an expectation and there is no discounting over time. So I think the idea to have in mind, how would I phrase it? I think if you asked me to guess, I would guess that like the numbers would change if there was some discounting over time. I would not expect I would still expect, like some kind of selfish mining to be profitable with some discounting over time, but I would definitely expect it to not be exactly 32.9. And I think the denominated in Bitcoin versus denominated in dollars, I actually think is a very interesting distinction. And maybe I'll just say this, like this second bullet about the statistical undetectability is like the first paper that like I've worked on that I know of too, but like trying to get at like thinking about rewards that really should be denominated in USD or something like that. I'm happy to answer more detailed questions too about that. Okay, so now I have like upcoming several slides and I'll need a little bit of feedback on how much of it to skip. So I started with a deck that I present to people who don't know anything about blockchain, that they're more from my community. So like, for example, I know to definitely skip this and so let me do this. I will present this slide. People in my community like knowing sometimes that there is a mathematically formal underlying game. So like, let me just quickly present this so you can at least get a taste of like how we view it. I think it's not going to be a particularly insightful game. It's just going to be like, okay, this is, how I think of blockchain mining. And I can see that, you can make it mathematically formal. Okay. All right. So what is this? This is starting by basically just saying like, you can view the blockchain as a graph if you want to call it a graph instead of calling it a blockchain. And, for the games we study, I assume that the distribution of mining power is fixed. It is definitely interesting to make richer models where people are investing and changing their mining power. But one theme from the stuff I do is I really like to understand one thing at a time. And so I'd say like each paper, I'm really trying to understand one thing. There are people who do different kinds of research where they look at 10 different things at once, but none of the stuff that I'm presenting is like that. So there's always something left out of the model, but I just want to understand one thing really well. Okay, so this is basically just saying, call it a graph instead of a blockchain. And all right, so now how would I model it as a game to try and abstract away a lot of the details from, say, like the Bitcoin protocol, while still kind of like being mathematically accurate? So, so one thing is I'll say like, yes, I do know that technically what happens is that everyone's independently mining and then at a random point in time, someone's selected to mine a block. That's not crucial to the incentives aspect. So let me just say like, whenever the first person in the network, whenever the next person finds a block, let's just call that the next time step. And whenever that time step is, it doesn't matter when it is, the person who found it is uniformly random, independent of whatever happened previously, independent of whatever that time is. So let's just make it simpler and just say that like, yeah, there's a random minor proportional to their hash rate selected every single step. And then what I really want to focus on, so I know that a lot of details go into what exactly is in a block, what can you do with a block. It's a network, you can broadcast to some people, but not others. Let's just make it really simple and just say that the two things you decide are you decide where are you going to point when you create a block, and you're going to decide when you want to broadcast your blocks. So those are the only two things that are going to be strategic in this game. Everything else, so say like I'm focused on 0 transaction fees, it's just based on the block reward. I'm not looking at sophisticated network style attacks where you broadcast to some people but not others. I'm just saying broadcast means you broadcast, everyone hears about it. So I want to really just dial into what can you do that's clever if you only change where you point and when you broadcast. Okay, so now what's your payoff? So I'm going to give some, again, like just to, basically prove that it's formal, but really your payoff is the steady state fraction of blocks that you create in the longest chain. And the justification for that, that's kind of been around since at least the selfish mining paper, maybe people talked about this earlier too, is it sort of because of the difficulty adjustment, the length of the longest chain grows, at a rate of 1 per 10 minutes. And so this means that, if you can if you can get other blocks out of the longest chain, you're lowering the difficulty. So it's easier for you to find blocks. You are getting more Bitcoin by doing that. So here is just like, yeah, if I want to make this formal, I would basically just say, actually, even for formal people, I think I'll skip that. Basically, you want the steady state fraction of blocks in the longest chain. This is going for, forever. So I care about time average stuff. And if I let this go forever and I use any reasonable strategy, all these things are going to be well defined. Okay. So let me skip this too, but this is basically just trying to be clear that if you really boil down to what are the aspects of the longest chain protocol that are relevant for this game, it basically just says when you build a block, point to the longest chain. If there's ties, maybe point to the one you first heard about. And as soon as you find something, just broadcast it. Okay. And so, I wasn't in the blockchain community before the selfish mining paper. And I know that, people probably would not have phrased it in formal language like this, but my understanding is that before the selfish mining paper, people thought that 51% was kind of like the limit. If you didn't have 51%, then there wasn't a whole lot of clever things you could do. And then, the intuition for this is that there is, maybe how I would view it is there is one specific strategy that doesn't work if you have less than 50%, right? And that one specific strategy is if you just try and make your own chain, then that's a really bad idea if you have less than 50%, because everyone will just overtake you. And so that strategy requires 51% to work. And what I think is clever about this is that they found, there's a different strategy. And this strategy, you can't double spend, but you can still kind of get a little bit more rewards. And I think maybe the community is still kind of figuring out how bad that is or exactly what that means. But it's at least something to think about. Okay, so I have slides prepared to introduce selfish mining to someone who knows nothing about selfish mining. I don't know for this group if you would like to see diagrams of going through what the strategy is, or if that's going to bore everyone, or yeah.
We can skip that.
Okay. All right.
We get to see the nice graphics as we go.
Yes.
They are nice.
Okay. So, okay, and then my understanding is that Miriam presented this to you guys. So I also don't have to, I will maybe just give a quick reminder, but I know she did in much more detail. So, so prior to basically last summer, I mostly presented this stuff in academic circles. And so sometimes people ask curious questions about, if the form has anyone tried this? And I was like, I don't know. And because it's just not my expertise. And then when I was at A16Z last summer, this was all people wanted to talk about because that's what they think about all the time. And so, so I spent some time actually looking into it and thinking, and I started thinking with Miriam about okay, maybe we should maybe there is some math and further things to think there. And And so what we did, so I don't know, like people in this room are probably better at understanding this than we were, but like we definitely did a pretty thorough lit review, and we even like looked on Reddit, and we tried to investigate when there were claims on Reddit that something had happened. We tried to figure out like what actually happened and stuff like that. And so I feel like we did, you know, a reasonably thorough job, but it would not shock me to learn that there's some community that we just like didn't, you know, learn about that maybe had detected something. But my understanding is that like even on altcoins, no one's really done this, or at least no one's detected it. Like no one's detected it and presented evidence and talked about it.
There was a long range replacement attack.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So those I would, yeah. So when we read that, Mary and I talked about like, what is the definition of selfish mining? And then I was like, I don't know, something like, I feel like the long range replacement feels more like double spending than selfish mining. And maybe it would be fun to like sit down and write down like what I think are the distinctions. But yeah.
So just, would you consider this selfish mining if you have a network topology where there is not quite the partitioned network, but one side has more than 50% of the hash rate, and there's a slower than average communication between the majority group and the minority group? This is sort of the very weak case of the mining on Mars question that sometimes comes out. And my understanding is if you say I have 60% here, 40% here, and there's, you know, 10 seconds between them, while there's only 1 second in between them, you're actually going to see that the 60% group gets more than 60% of the rewards, simply because others, they more often build on top of their own stuff than others, which is
That's a good question.
Similar outcome as selfish mining, but it is not an attack in the sense that it's not a strategy. It's a, it could even happen completely unintentionally.
Did it happen with the Great Firewall of China?
Yeah, basically.
It didn't.
I mean, presumably they would have had a minuscule higher revenue than if they were better connected to the rest.
And I don't even have evidence that.
Yeah,
this
that's a good
happened,
question.
But looking at stale block rates over time and seeing orders of magnitude changes in that is sort of an indication that things like this may have happened.
So I think I would say, so this is on the spot, so it's possible I would change my mind in like, you know, 15 minutes even. That I think one key feature that what you described also has is that I think it should not be like selfish mining. It is not a consensus breaking attack, whereas like a long range reorg is like also reorging consensus. And so I feel like that should be one that it's not a direct threat to consensus, in the sense that like you could, like, even if someone is selfish mining and you knew that someone was selfish mining, you could still, you know, like wait your 6 blocks, and that selfish miner is very unlikely to be hiding 6 blocks. And that would still be kind of like safe to use the system. So I think that's one important aspect. Second one is that I think the rewards you get are entirely due to like block rewards or transaction fees versus, you know, like double spending. And third is, but that sounds like a property that you mentioned too. Third is like, I feel like I want to say that it's about, it should be about like being strategic with something in the consensus protocol, that like selfish mining is doing something strategic to interact with the consensus protocol. I don't know, like if someone like if you told me like, oh, I have someone said I have an interesting attack, which is I broadcast to some people but not others, and I would probably, and it had the other properties, I probably would call that selfish mining, but like I haven't thought super hard, and I've realized I probably use the term inconsistently, and other people probably mean something different. But I can say, okay, so what did I mean here? I mean, I'm not aware from this literature search and Reddit review, certainly of anyone using this specific like short blockchain reorg style selfish mining. And I am aware of one instance that I'll mention at the end of the talk. There was what I would consider a strategic manipulation on Ethereum before the merge. And that was, I thought, super interesting, but that's the only thing I'm aware of that's been ever detected from like this kind of work. So there's
Wasn't there a minor attacking, IO attacked Satoshi dice on the payout? But I mean,
That's interaction.
that's more of a double spend, right?
Yeah.
Also, I had a follow-up question. You said that a long-range reorg, like we saw on Verge, would be a consensus attack. What do you mean with consensus in that regard?
I mean that like so I don't know the details of this attack, but my understanding of like what a long-range reorg would be is that I as a user of Bitcoin, I kind of like don't really care if people are selfish mining, that like it looks like the same product to me, that like like maybe in the long term my opinion is in the long term I definitely should be concerned if someone is selfish mining, because it means it may not be decentralized forever or whatever. But like in terms of right now, it's it's still a ledger, and it's not reorging more than 6 blocks at a time, and so like to me it looks the same. Whereas like if someone's doing like a long range reorg, then all of a sudden the product doesn't look like a good product to me, because I don't know, like all my transactions are now changed or something like that.
So an attack on the consensus mechanism and consensus system rather than the consensus rules.
Yeah, maybe that's a way to think of it. Yeah. There's a question in the chat on has anyone worked out the Nash equilibrium when miners are strategic? So my understanding is no, and that is like a super hard question to think about, basically because like how do I put it? So just to figure out that a specific strategy, so just to figure out that selfish mining is profitable, requires you to analyze a specific Markov chain. And that is something that like a lot of people are comfortable doing. And so like, Eyal and Sierra did that, and that was great. To figure out the optimal strategy when everyone else is honest, that's now what's called like a Markov decision process. There are also people who are comfortable with that, but that is like a way harder problem that like just to kind of approximately solve, there are like fancy algorithms that do that. And to solve that closed form is not something that how do I put it? It's not something that like lots and lots of people have lots and lots of tools to solve Markov decision processes in closed form. There probably are researchers who are very good at doing that, but I think that's like a much more narrow community than just like analyzing Markov chains. And now if you want to talk about having like Markov, if everyone is using a Markov decision process that's induced based on what other strategies other people are using, I think that is an extremely messy problem to try and reason about, to possibly solve in closed form. I think it is conceivable that someone who's like very good in this space could make simulations and have the Markov decision processes like approximately solving and responding to each other. That's something I could imagine someone who's a really good like that kind of machine learning experimentalist doing. But I think that that's like a very hard problem to actually figure out like what's a Nash equilibrium when everyone can be strategic.
Sorry, maybe I don't understand the question. What would you figure out what the Nash equilibrium is? You know that it's profitable or it's not profitable.
Yeah. So you can basically sort of like, so I proposed a game. Every game has a Nash equilibrium, and so then you can. So basically, what I'm saying is, if there's at least one sufficiently large miner, the Nash equilibrium is not everyone follows the protocol. So then you can separately ask like, okay, so how do I know that? I know that because there is at least one player such that when everyone else is following the protocol, it's strictly better for me to not do it. And so now you can ask a follow-up question, which is like, okay, so everyone's going to be strategic. So everyone's considering selfish mining. And maybe if I'm selfish mining, you don't want to be honest. You want to do something else. And so now that you're not being honest, maybe I don't want to selfish mine. I want to do something even more creative that wouldn't have been profitable if you were being honest. So there's like, so everything depends on everything else. And I think that would be like very hard to find in closed form. Okay. Okay. So let me maybe just give like kind of a quick, since I know Miriam was here and I have other stuff I can talk about, I'll just give kind of like a quick reminder of what this result was. So what we focused on is that one way that you might look at a blockchain and say like something looks weird here is, I would say like forks or orphans maybe like naturally happen due to latency because there's just like, there's all these independent processes, two of them ding at the same time, and now you have a fork. And if that's your belief for why forks happen, you would expect this to happen kind of like at every height independently. So you would expect to see like, oh, you would not expect to see kind of like unusually long runs of orphans, or you would expect to see them at a specific rate, and you would not expect to be more likely to see an orphan because there was an orphan in the previous round, if this is your model for where they come from. And in selfish mining, that's not what happens. In selfish mining, given that there is an orphan here, what that means is that, okay, this happened because the selfish miner hit a block and created a conflict. And now that they just hit a block, you're more likely to see an orphan in the next round too, because that will happen as long as the selfish miner found one block before everything got resolved, and that's just more likely to happen. So anyway, so that was what we focused on. There are other ways if you really wanted to test specifically for selfish mining. There are other things you could do, like if you believe that people aren't manipulating their timestamps, you could look at the difference in timestamps between like, when you heard about a block and when it was claimed to be published, that you'd be seeing a lot of blocks arriving to you like way after the timestamp, and something about that would look weird. But anyway, so this is what we focused on. And I don't know if there's interest. I mean, if you guys already discussed this with Miriam, then I don't know if there's interest in rediscussing this, but we tried to think through sort of like, given that it's not happening in practice, like what are possible reasons for that? And I think where we eventually settled is that I think all of the reasons listed here are good, but to me, they feel like not fundamental in the sense that like what I had heard. So like this third bullet, I heard secondhand, but I heard secondhand from multiple people that sort of like they said, we talked to mining pools, and the mining pools are like, I don't have energy to think about selfish mining. I'm, like worried about people, doing block withholding on me or all sorts of stuff like that. And there's just like other things for people to worry about that get, bigger gains than like this extra 0.1% that you can get from selfish mining. And so like all these totally make sense to me. But the one that I feel like is kind of like not state dependent is just like, it's probably the case that sort of like, at any point in time, like some market would react in some way if there was like large scale selfish mining on a coin. Like, I don't know how they would react. And like, I don't know how easy it is to like short, and like how, good people are at like predicting how the exchange rate and whether shorting is a good idea or whatever, but like definitely will react in some way. And I can believe that that's kind of scary if you have a lot of, like hardware locked up in Bitcoin to do something very risky, just may not seem like a good idea. Yeah.
Comment here that I have no other answers than the one you mentioned, but I have at times I think the mining landscape in Bitcoin and in other proof of work altcoins has been substantially different. Where in Bitcoin, for almost the entirety of its history, I think most mining pools are well known, are public. There's maybe some unclear influences between some of them, co-ownership, whatever, but they're well known. Well, I haven't paid attention to this in a few years, but before that, in certain altcoins, this was like Bitcoin was completely different. They were like all anonymous, and there were like various kinds of attacks they were trying on each other. No selfish mining like ones, but
yeah. So I think
and I don't know. I don't even have a good explanation for why that was the case, that was so different between these worlds.
It is a good question. I also I also don't have an answer, so I should probably just stop there and not say something arbitrary, but yeah, but I'm also not sure.
Also, I think in Bitcoin, especially the top 90% or so of the hash rate is coordinated through public mining pools. So
Mm,
anyone dropping off the grid and starting to mine separately would either be visible or, I
Yeah.
mean, it's sort of the first point, but it's like.
yeah. Yeah. So I think yeah. So anyway, I would say sort of like, basically I think I would just say that sort of like the kind of stuff I think about is definitely a step. I don't want to be like fully detached from reality, but I definitely intend to be a step detached from like what's happening right now, if that makes sense. And so sort of like, I don't know if if, for example, the long-term vision of, Bitcoin for the next 50 years is that it will stay like 90% of blocks mined by public mining pools. And, and there's like infrastructure, infrastructure in place. So I sort of feel like, or even if it is, I think sort of like the kind of stuff I like doing is at least identifying that sort of like why that's important, or like what would change if that, like if that were no longer the case, or what would be important to think about if that were no longer the case.
I think the last few months might have also been interesting for research materials. So Foundry just had an over 30%, they were at 25% or so, getting close to 50-ish, and they changed their reward structure in order to incentivize people moving elsewhere. They used to not take fees. Now they started taking fees in order to get individual miners to use a different mining pool. And also we've had a lot more stale blocks recently with the out of band transactions and generally bigger blocks. So
No.
I mean, yeah, I'm just wondering whether you're also watching the current.
So yeah, so I don't have like a good I would say so even in kind of like my pre-blockchain expertise, I was like always like a theoretician. So like even for data that like non-blockchain researchers are comfortable accessing, like I don't know how to do that stuff. So definitely for like blockchain data, I don't have like my own good link to it. And on top of that, I'm not in like a fully blockchain environment. So like sometimes I get like, while I'm here, I get like immersed for however long I'm here at stuff like that. But I'm not in a environment where sort of like all the stuff you're describing about, like I'm largely hearing kind of like for the first time. And then I go back and think about it, like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder, I'll look into it more or something like that. Yeah.
You should visit more often.
Yeah.
2 or 3 weeks ago, we had free stale blocks in 4 days, which is a significant
Yeah.
increase over. But last year we were more like 1 block every other month.
Yeah.
Or so. And so especially since February, since the whole ordinal craze took off, the stale block rate has increased significantly, and to the point that with a bunch of transactions going out of band, the block relay has slowed down, or presumably because compact block relay has slowed
Got
down.
it.
And block latency, distribution of block propagation has higher latency. So from a more practical standpoint,
Yeah.
I think it's interesting stuff.
So
regardless going
yeah, so I'd say like in terms of interaction with this, I would say that so like the last time I gave this talk, someone told me that basically at the time I'd given that talk, which was more than a few months ago, they said there's basically been like no orphans in Bitcoin anymore. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize that.
Like 6 in half a year or so.
Yeah. And so I was like, wow, yeah, definitely. So definitely if your kind of like model of the state of the world where everyone is honest is there's no orphans. And then all of a sudden there's like orphans for some reason, and you can't explain it by the fact that, that like that ordinals are taking off or the blocks are bigger or something like that. Then that alone would be, like that. Then all of a sudden, all the stuff I'm saying about trying to do selfish mining in an undetectable way doesn't make sense, because if you want to do selfish mining, you have to at least create an orphan. And so sort of like, so I'd say sort of like the threat of stuff like this and stuff like this being harder to detect, I guess, would go up as orphans become more natural or something like that. So that's kind of like maybe the interaction that would have with this. Okay, so let me just remind you of the result with Miriam was just that there is a different selfish mining style strategy that has the following properties. So it is strictly profitable, but you need to have a little bit more. So it's 38.2 instead of 33. But what it buys you over the previous ones is that if you just want to focus on the orphan pattern, it gives you an orphan pattern that looks like it could have happened just by, normal network latency. And so, and you can kind of trade this off that if you want to make it look arbitrarily close to what the current pattern is, you can do that. You're just going to profit less by doing that. And if you want to make it, you're comfortable making it look like there's more latency, then you can profit more. But you can, if you want to, make it look like basically nothing is happening and it would look right. Okay. So let me shift now and talk about the difference between block reward and transaction fees. So everything I mentioned so far. So the model is what I posted, which is just that you get, there's exclusively block rewards. And in all the previous work, we just said basically assume the transaction fees are 0. And I like showing this slide. So like, this is the slide that when we were giving talks about this in 2016, I changed the 6.25 from 12.5 at the time. But at the time, and I believe it's still the case, but I think you guys would know better, that I believe that the transaction fees are still not dominating the block rewards, that the block rewards are still the dominant form.
Yes, but a couple of weeks ago, we had an enormous spike in bidding on block space. So fee rates went over 500 Satoshis per VByte, and for a whole week, we got about 20 blocks in a day that were paying a higher transaction fee than block subsidy. So the block reward was more than twice the subsidy.
Interesting. Okay. So maybe this future is not that far off, but yeah.
We have a new use case on
Yeah.
Bitcoin again, new in third iteration or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of block space bidding.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is another example, right, where sort of I think it's reasonable to say clearly the right model is transaction fees and block rewards, but I feel like that it makes the math very messy. I feel like it's not clear to me exactly what you learn by forcing both into the model. So the stuff that I've done is focus on just one or just the other and try and understand how they're different. Okay, so this is, the, I don't know, the 2050 version of Bitcoin or maybe sooner, where the transaction fees dominate the block reward. And at the time when we started giving this, I remember the block size debate was a huge thing. And I actually, you guys probably know better. I assume people still kind of talk about it, but it's nowhere near as hot as it was in 2016.
Well, actually, at the end of last year, there was a big debate about whether or not we should consider putting a tail emission. So people were worried about the block space demand being so low that fees were always low. That basically every day you could get transactions to confirm at minimum fee rate, minimum relay transaction fee rate, which is 1 cent per relay. And now since February, the fee rates have gone through the roof, and tail emission is pretty down. People are complaining about the high fees.
Got it. So yeah, so the reason I bring this up is sort of that this seems sort of immediately everyone's oh yeah, this is something to think about. If the fees are low and there's no block reward, then that's a big problem. And what at least prior to our work, was it sort of I think this is initially good intuition, is it yeah, if you have risk neutral miners, let's assume that we get the fees up. So the fees are 6.25 Bitcoin on average. So we get the right number. And then once you do that, then sort of yeah, miners are risk neutral. They're mining lots of blocks. Everything's, you have the variance reduction through mining pools. Then that's the big thing. And then sort of so I started on this project, I think this was the first time I was learning about blockchain from Arvin directly, which was kind of cool. But as I was going through this project, I think we didn't know what to expect. And then sort of I think what we learned is that it just really changes the game. And I think so I'll give brief intuition for all these, but I think yes, sorry. So risk neutral means that like, say that I told you that either I will pay you $1 or I'll flip a coin and I'll give you either $2 if it's heads and 0 if it's tails, then you're like, those are the same to me. So that's what risk neutral means. And then sort of like the idea would be that probably individual miners, the fact that they join mining pools means the individual miners are probably not risk neutral because they're like getting lower expected reward specifically in order to get, reduce variance. But, the big mining pools that are, mining a block like every 2 hours or so are probably risk neutral, that they're just trying to maximize the expected reward. So the intuition for where all of these comes from is basically just that your strategy can depend on how many fees are in a block. And that is something that just does not make sense in the block reward setting, that every block is worth the same. So it doesn't make sense to say, oh, if this block is worth 10 times as much as normal, don't hide that to selfish mind, just take it and win. And if this is less than normal, hide it to selfish mind. That doesn't make sense. Everything's worth 6.25. So, so I just wanted to go through the kinds of behaviors we looked at. So we said so I think fee sniping is, I think, something people had been aware of, before our paper, that's not very sophisticated. That just says that if I see a high value transaction in a block, that I should try to steal it. And maybe I'll get lucky and even if I'm a, 10% of the hash rate, if this block is worth 50 times as much as normal, then it's worth just giving it a shot to try and fork it. That's what I should do. And again, that doesn't make sense when all blocks are worth 6.25. You're never going to be in a situation where you say, yeah, I want to take a 90% shot at losing stuff just to try and win this specific 6.25.
The real reason is the transaction can only go into one block.
Yes.
Right? Well, the subsidies and everything.
Exactly. Yeah. And then we also looked at, we said, well, another thing you might try and do, in addition to just fee sniping, is instead of hoping that you get lucky and mine 2 in a row, why don't you try and incentivize other people to do it too? So if the mempool is limited, then maybe what I would try and do is I would say, hey, someone just created a block that has a really high fee. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just that fee for myself and otherwise make an empty block. And now if someone's trying to choose whether to point to this guy or point to me, then there is just more stuff in the mempool because I left it out. And, you're not really violating the longest chain. I'm still, there. I'm just asking you to tie break in a different way. So he said, that's a possibility. Yeah.
Does fee sniping make sense if there's also subsidy? Because you have a low, you have a whole much work, right? And you see a block that I've created and I have more people for it. And you snipe my transaction, there's oh, that's huge.
Yeah.
But it's still, I mean, do the same thing, right? And I have more blocks than all win than you have. So, if you're deviating from the normal behavior, I don't have that strategy the whole team in my normal set of things I do. Then maybe you will win one or twice, but as long as I get that done multiple times to me, I'm gonna start doing it.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think what I would say is I do not think, so I'd say if there were, let me just do a really extreme one to not have to do any math. If there were a block that was worth 1,000 times as much as normal, I do not think it would be an equilibrium for every miner to just not try and snipe. It may be that there's a very degenerate equilibrium where everyone's trying to snipe, or it could be that just there's one miner who's a little bit larger than everyone else. And so for a short period, everyone's going to be trying to snipe and this large miner is going to win. And so maybe it could be that that's not an equilibrium because everyone who's not the largest miner knows they're going to lose. And so they just let that large miner win. Or it could be that, if the largest miner is 11%, someone else is 10%, then it's an equilibrium for both of them to give it a shot until eventually one of them gets a lead by 10 blocks. And then once you have a 10 block lead, now it's just not worth trying, now it's just so unlikely that you'd succeed. So I think I think what I feel comfortable with is that if the block is large enough, then there's definitely not an equilibrium where everyone just doesn't try to snipe it. but depending on exactly the hash rates of everyone and the ratio of this to the, the block reward subsidy, it may need to be quite large for that to happen. So I think all the stuff, so like all the stuff that I think we discuss is more about like understanding what can happen. And I think very much not predicting that anything will happen or trying to say that like, anything is doomed or stuff like that. I think that's, I think that never been a good thing to try and predict. So, and then the last two things. So like, I think that this one is just kind of, it's interesting that if you just use exactly the same selfish mining strategy, the math changes. If you're curious why that is, maybe I can talk about that after the talk. It's interesting to know that the math changes a bit, but like, I don't think there's anything like super, super interesting there. I think the more interesting thing is just like what I mentioned, which is like, this thing that doesn't make sense with the block reward, which is it like, if you happen to just like find a block, like say that, for example, the mempool is regularly getting drained and I get unlucky and I find a block like, 30 seconds after the last one, the mempool hasn't really refilled yet, and my block's just not worth a lot. Like I should definitely just hide that and try and selfish mine, right? Like it's not worth a lot. The risk of losing it is low, and it's worth just as much in terms of helping me selfish mine as any other block. So I should just give that a shot. And on the other hand, if I happen to find a block that's worth a whole lot, then I should definitely not hide it and risk losing it to selfish mining. And that's a strategy that only makes sense because the block reward varies. And what works out is just that, like, no matter how small I am, there is a significantly small number such that if the block is literally, very close to worthless, no matter how small I am, it's, like I should just hide it. Like if it's literally worthless, I should definitely just hide it and try to selfish mine. If I'm a 1% miner, it doesn't have to be worthless. It has to be less than something, and it might be very unlikely and the profit's very small. But it's just something that you have to think about. Yeah.
Would it be that in this situation where you're a very small miner and the block is worthless, you shouldn't be mining at all? You should be just saving, like even selfish mining is not your strategy.
So I think it really depends on the variance, I think. So like if you're so I think it depends on sort of like what I'm saying is sort of like the expected rewards are still high. It's just that somehow the expected rewards can be high and occasionally you will find a worthless block, if that makes sense. So it's, sorry, I also understand the other thing you said. Sorry, I think I understand your question better. Was you were saying, should you just like turn off your electricity and stop mining? So that is another thing you could consider doing. And that is, so basically that is something we did discuss in the paper. It's outside the scope of like this specific thing, but that is also an issue where it very well could be, so my, sorry, let me give a longer answer. My understanding is that in 2016, when Miles, I think, said he was at a conference, 7 years old, so I'm sorry if I'm misremembering, but I think he was at a conference, he spoke to some miner, and he mentioned to them this concept, and he said they told him, there is no way we're turning off our electricity. The only reason we get cheap electricity is because we promise to always use it. Right. But if it were the case that sort of like you were literally paying per electricity as you were using it, and your costs were primarily electricity and not the hardware and not the operation and stuff like that, then that is another dimension that I would definitely consider as possibly being a good idea, and that may be better than selfish mining is to just turn off too. That I think that's, I think I find that interesting to model, and maybe, I would just say like I find that interesting to model, but I'm not aware that I'm not aware of work that has studied both of those together yet, and I think that actually does sound kind of tractable to try and do.
Similar to that, you happen to find a block or like a main right? Would it make sense to, instead of like build on top of that block that you have found, build on top of the what that you will build? So kind of like I save this one just in case someone like finds something before me, and if it does, I mean I may relate it. But otherwise, so I don't make the change longer and there's no difficulty adjustment. I think I'm kind of like playing on making the difficulty adjustment last long, right? I'm not gonna mine this block because it's worthless for me. I mean, like, continue mining on top of the previous one.
Yeah, I think you're on.
You're not, because you're not getting anything, right? Like, or almost anything. Like,
You announce your, well, what you just do.
I'm wondering if it's worth just keeping it. Like, imagine that you're making like 1,000 satoshis by like mining them.
Yeah,
But,
so
but if you're attacking yourself, you have the same total revenue if you just produce the child of your block and collect the dropping up fees on that new block. And then when somebody else finds a block, you still have a higher chance of having the second block at that point. So you still.
But like,
Yeah.
see, what you're gonna make by like having that first block is like almost not like completely nothing.
yeah, so
But it's strictly worse to attack your own block than to start yourself.
so I think the
long run, right? Like,
Yeah, like you're trying to keep the hash rate low for the minutes that there will be.
so I think so here's the so I think the real question is do you care about the difficulty adjustment when there's no block reward? So for there, I would say no. So for selfish mining with the block reward, you care about attacking the, you want to lower the difficulty because that lets you get more block rewards per minute per unit time. However, changing the difficulty adjustment does not let you get more transaction fees per unit time. So I would say, so if you're in the model where there's 0 block reward and it's just transaction fees, then like gaming the difficulty adjustment, I actually don't see how that's helpful because the fees are, the fees are coming, that's totally external to the difficulty adjustment. So like keeping the difficulty low, like again, like maybe for external reasons to the model, like, I don't know, like you just prefer to find blocks faster or something like that, then that makes sense. But for the raw rewards in the model, it wouldn't help you to lower the difficulty. If there were a block reward and transaction fees, then you do care about lowering the difficulty, but then you're sort of like, why do you want to, but then you actually are losing something when you override your own block. So I think my guess is no, or at least like I can't think of a reason. That's my guess. Yeah.
Even in a setting with just transaction fees, if you can game the difficulty, you can affect the throughput of, like, you can affect the total market space.
You can increase the block space.
That's true.
And on this, if there is some non-linearity in.
That's true. Yeah.
People are willing to pay, this may be a good idea or a bad idea.
That's true. So that's true. So I think that was also something you asked us at the beginning of the talk. So that was something outside of our model. We assumed that the block space was unlimited to keep the math simple. So I think if you had, so like, for example, so one thing that would be very different is if you had a very binding block size, right? Now, all of a sudden, I don't expect that much natural variance. Maybe you guys would tell me I'm wrong, but like, like if the mempool is always like 10 blocks full at any given time, then like all of a sudden I'm sort of like, maybe ordinal drops still cause crazy things, but I would say I wouldn't expect the steady state to be like really high variance. So like when we were thinking about the paper, again, like 2016, we were thinking about like variance comes from just like the transaction fees are steady, the transaction fees are stable, but just from the fact that I can find a block 30 seconds after you or 10 minutes after you, that causes variance in the size of the mempool. So from that perspective, if you say everything is stable, everything is steady, everything is high enough, and there's 10 blocks worth of stuff in the mempool at any given time, then all of a sudden you don't really have any, then you don't really have any variance. The variance would need to come from like an ordinal drop or something external or something like that. And so we were, to justify our model at the time, we were thinking about the variance that came from just the 30 seconds versus 10 minutes and draining the mempool every time. But yeah.
So funnily enough, the mempool has been over 150 blocks worth of transactions for over 2 weeks straight. And it is tending up.
And so now I'm also curious, during that time, are the fees still varying or
Yes,
the,
in these past 2 weeks, the fees have peaked over 500 sats per rebyte and the fee rates, sorry. And recently it's been settling more around 40 to 60 sats per rebyte, but you still get a little bit of a, like, not much, but
yeah,
way smoother, but you still get a variance throughout the day and
Yeah.
with like
So, yeah, so I think maybe, so I guess maybe if we were gonna like rewrite the paper in 2023, I think we would probably not really bother saying assume an unlimited. I think we would just say that there's variance for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, I find that paper from, what was it, 2016?
Yeah.
Or whatever, with the unlimited block.
Yeah.
It feels a little contrary to the key assumption that eventually there will be enough block space demand that we will have a steady state of fees. And then assuming unlimited block.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah.
Bitcoin is unstable in the absence of block reward field or block subsidy.
Yeah.
Feels a little, well, we're assuming there's going to be fees.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I agree with that. So I think the yeah, so I think if I were to go like, given how things evolved and like what the steady state is, I would probably rewrite it and I would come with a different model for where the variance comes from. And I think like I think one of the things that's at least we try to do in this kind of work is say that sort of like the takeaways should still hold even if you change the mathematical model a bit or something like that. And I feel like the takeaways will still hold if I change the mathematical model to better match today, better than what we decided then. But we kind of wound up there both from sort of like a appeal to like the cleanliness of math and like the story we could imagine at the time or something like that. Yeah.
Sure, but in the more practical blogosphere.
I agree.
Support,
Yeah.
I've seen multiple times now the idea explored of block space as the second good produced by the Bitcoin network, one being the Bitcoins themselves and the other one being block space as a limited resource, limited over production, not scarce in total. And so, yeah, if you were going to exploit more in that direction, I would be very interested in what you
Yeah,
come up
that
with.
makes sense. And so there's two questions here. One is, do any of the strategies change the incentives of transactors to pay fees? That's interesting. Yes. So I have not thought like very thoroughly through all of that. But I think, for example, if I was concerned, say that I thought that miners were comfortable doing fee sniping in the event of like a whale transaction, it would definitely disincentivize me to produce a whale transaction fee because, presumably the initial reason I did that was I really wanted to get into the block immediately. And the mental model I had was I put in a high fee, miners immediately take me first, and then I'm immediately in. But if all the miners are doing like fee sniping or undercutting, then like all of a sudden that means I produced my whale transaction fee. And now there's like a pause in consensus for a while everyone chases my whale transaction fee. And then, like once that eventually resolves, then my transaction is in. So like that's one example. That's like the first example that comes to mind. There may be other subtler ways, but I think that I think the short answer to your question is yes, that like if you are in a situation where the variance in transaction fees is high enough that miners are doing games based on the variance in transaction fees, then that definitely incentivizes you to like think harder about the fees you do, that it's not just the case that submitting a higher fee is going to get you in a consensus stable block quicker. Okay, the next question is, am I suggesting that I think the results would hold even if not assuming in limited block space? So I think based on the discussion that just happened, I'm saying like yes, with all sorts of caveats. So I think the important thing is that there has to be variance in the transaction fees that could be, like there has to be variance in the total sum of transaction fees that could be included in a block from the mempool over time. And so like, for example, one reason that could happen is there's unlimited block space and everything is arriving smoothly and stably. That's what we chose to look at. Another reason that could happen is just like there's an ordinal drop. And so like this block is just worth a lot more. Another reason that could happen is if like there's a blackout for some reason and nobody wants to use Bitcoin for an hour for some reason. And so I think like any events like that cause variance would be sufficient for like these results to hold. The precise math would change depending on like exactly what is a source of variance and stuff like that. But I think the point is that like the intuition for all of this is just that if you believe that sometimes you will create blocks that are worth much less than normal, you should definitely hide those to selfish mine. And if you believe that sometimes you will create blocks that are significantly more valuable than normal, then you should try to fee snipe them. And we proposed a specific mathematical explanation for why that would happen, which, you know, we said was the unlimited block size. But I think if you have if your belief is that that will happen, no matter why that happens, that would incentivize this kind of behavior.
So, are you familiar with the idea of fee smoothing? The idea
That would be that like I smooth the fees over the previous, yeah.
like using some function, fees are paid not just to the block
Yeah.
that includes it, but to some of
Yeah.
the blocks after it too. I'd imagine that this sort of like quantitatively changes
Agree.
things, but
Yep.
not fundamentally, because once if you have a whale transaction, that still has
Yeah.
extraordinary effect. You get
I agree. And the other thing I would say is, so the bigger thing I would be concerned about with that, which again, maybe you guys maybe know how relevant this is in practice, is that I think the bigger issue is that if I have to share, if I'm mining a block and you're telling me the rule is that you're willing to pay 10 Bitcoin to include your transaction in the block. And if I include it, I'm getting a 10th of a Bitcoin. Then I would just tell you, like, screw that.
yes.
Give me just 1 Bitcoin. I'll you know, like pay me off chain, and then we'll smooth the nothing. So I feel like I would be I feel like that would be my bigger concern with fee smoothing. But that is not captured in like the existing models, and so it's good motivation to like, you know, make the model richer to make sure that like that doesn't solve the model. But I do agree that if there were some way to smooth it out, like basically anything that reduces variance is good for resolving this problem. And then the question is just like how can you do it without creating other problems? Yeah, and I don't have a good answer for that.
I mean, the thing that comes to mind is that the Ethereum model was like part of the fee firm. Have you looked into that or?
Yeah, so Ethereum's model is interesting, and I would say basically what they so I think that what the EIP 1559 does well, and I'm copying a lot of this intuition from like Tim's paper and what I've heard Tim say, is that when the fees are stable, that EIP 1559 does do a really good job of keeping the block reward like exactly the same. And so
It generates like, I mean.
Exactly. Yeah. So right. So then the problem is that when fees are unstable, then it's still just exactly the same as this. So there's not any approach that I'm aware of that says even when there's an NFT drop that no one saw coming, that somehow the fees are still going to be, you know, like constant over the next 10 blocks and the previous 10 blocks. So I'm not aware of. I don't know if that's even a plausibly solvable problem, but I think that's the that's the heart of the problem, is to somehow deal with that. So I don't know, given that it's like a few minutes after 12 and this is like a natural pause point, if I should just pause and chat with whoever wants to. Okay.
We hang out until lunch.
Okay. Then I will keep going. So what so I think this is it for the so I already talked through this without the math on the slide. So so I don't know. So I mean, so what I can do from here, so this is the end of the stuff I have prepared on proof of work. I'm happy to just like keep chatting about that kind of stuff. I'm happy to share if you guys are curious to see like what does selfish mining look like in proof of stake, or like what do these kinds of attacks look like in other protocols. I'm happy to just like, I have slides prepared, I can just go through that. But
anything better or worse or what?
It's worse. Yeah.
Worse?
Sorry, worse as in like it's more of a problem.
But it's better, is it's more interesting to study?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Yeah. So maybe let me give you some intuition. So okay, let me not, so like again, here is a formal definition of what's going on, but let me try and give you intuition for like where the biggest challenge comes from. So let me see if I even have a slide. So I think the biggest issue, so proof of work, I didn't appreciate this until like I started looking at proof of stake. I think the one thing that proof of work does amazing is there is an external source of randomness that's independent of whatever's going on in the blockchain. That is actually like super important. The first paper I had looking at like simple longest chain proof of stake, the biggest issue is just that like if you're using the blockchain as pseudo randomness itself, then like something is going to be predictable about future randomness. And as soon as something is predictable, like it doesn't even have to be manipulable. As soon as it's predictable, there's stuff you can do. So for example, the main, so like here's the main thing, like the main intuition here is,
Sorry, when you're just talking about randomness and randomness sources, do you generally consider it as like degrees of entropy? Like, is that the model you use?
Yeah, so I don't do like that level, like that low level of like mathematical rigor for like where the randomness is. So like, for example, for proof of work, I'm totally comfortable just saying it gives you a uniformly random number or picks a uniformly random minor, stuff like that. And for the pseudo randomness, I'd also totally comfortable just saying that like it, picks a uniformly random coin, picks a uniformly random minor, totally fine with that. The main distinction I would just say is like for, but I do want to be rigorous about at what point do I know the randomness? So like in proof of work, I don't know until the moment I'm selected to mine that I was selected to mine. And in proof of stake, like as a straw man one, say that you do something where you're like, what would we just say? There's a single pseudo random number generator and it outputs, like 15,000 numbers. And those are the 15,000 coins that are going to mine the next 15,000 blocks. Then I'm comfortable saying that's 15,000 independent, uniformly random coins. But like everyone knows right now who's going to mine the next 15,000 blocks. And so like that distinction I want to be rigorous about. And so I would say that like if you do something kind of very naive like that, then like one thing you can do, like I like using the lens of selfish mining, but basically the new thing that lets me do is it's like, why would I hide a block to selfish mine if I'm not going to find the next block? Like if I know I'm going to lose, just like don't selfish mine and lose. So it's like risk-free selfish mining. So that was kind of like the main point of the first paper. Let me just skip through this and say, like, so this is what we learned from the first paper, is that like the external source of randomness versus the internal source of randomness is a big deal. And that the internal source of randomness, if you do it exclusively with the blockchain, that we just found that there's like, you can do all these creative things to try and get around it, but like, like it's just always going to be a problem unless you're doing something to inject like an external source of randomness, or using like MPC to compute the randomness and nobody can predict it or something like that.
What's the state of the art of Ethereum currently?
So oh man. So I like do know, but I haven't thought about it in a while. So it is manipulable. And my understanding is that the community knows it's manipulable. And I was speaking with someone about, I think I was actually supposed to follow up with them like 3 months ago, and I'm just remembering now that I never did that. But like, I think that my understanding is that at the time it had not been optimized, like what is the best manipulation you can do. And that is something that I think is tractable to figure out. But I think they know that it is like, it is manipulable in the sense that you could be like a block proposer more often than your fair share if you game if you gain the pseudo-random seed. And I think that is generally the case in a lot of these like BFT protocols that it's hard to say like exactly what if there's a block reward, then for the proposer, you would get more block rewards. If the transaction fees go to the proposer, the MEV goes to the proposer, you would get more MEV because you would just be proposing more often. And you would do that by like manipulating the seed. So let me say, so a second point here that I learned is, so I said the previous paper was learning external versus internal. And so that was a huge distinction. The other thing, so we thought after that, we said just hypothetically, I know that like assuming a randomness beacon is a big assumption, but let's say if you had a randomness beacon and, say you do this very simple thing where you just say like, the randomness beacon will output a coin every 10 minutes and whoever owns that coin, you're the miner. And you only learn the moment that 10 minutes hits, you learn that you're the miner. Is that the same as proof of work? Is it, meaningfully different? And what we learned is that it is meaningfully different, but it doesn't make selfish mining that much better. So what I want to highlight here is in proof of work. So what I learned, the second interesting property about proof of work is the moment you are selected to mine, your block is also set. That the moment you're selected to mine, you cannot change where you point. That's relevant for the stuff I like looking at, but you also can't change the transactions. That's relevant for like MEV style stuff. And this is not the case, even with external randomness in proof of stake, that the point is you're selected to mine. Now you know that information, but until you actually broadcast a block, you can still change the contents. So for the game that I like looking at, this is meaningfully different. So let me just show you an example of something you can do. It's not obvious that it's profitable, but the main idea is you say, let me just do the picture. So say that like what happens is, you find a block and you hide it. If I had done the previous ones, the red means you haven't broadcast it yet, so you hide it. You're trying to do selfish mining. And then someone else finds a block. So now you're like, oh man, I'm in danger of losing. And now you're like, oh man, I just lost. Longest chain. And I called this save orphans selfish mining. So from here, regular selfish mining just has to be like, I lost, whatever. And the interesting thing is that in proof of work, the moment you find this block, you have to decide, are you going to try to save block 2 and point there the moment you find it? Or are you going to just give up and point to block 4? In proof of work, you have to decide right now. In proof of stake, you don't. So in proof of stake, you can say, let me see what happens. And you say, oh, it turns out I did find the next block. And because I found the next block, I can bring back 2. And now I've saved that. And now I have the longest chain.
I'm a little bit confused about what you meant by in proof of work, the miner once selected to mine can choose, because from my
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Decide ahead of
Yep.
time.
Also,
which
yep.
one they think is
Great
selected.
question. So yeah, so what you really should think through is so if you're literally mining right now, you should think sort of like, in case this is the hash that proves my work, where would I like to be pointing? Right. And then think like at every moment in time, you should be thinking, in case I happen to succeed right now, where do I want to be pointing?
I see. So
And now,
effectively considering strategies where proof of work miners will like selectively actually, I don't know, pick which block they may choose to submit a hash query.
yeah, exactly.
Basically, with every block that you create, you decide again and immediately learn whether.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is basically like thinking of it as the moment after you succeed or the moment right before you succeed, you would make the same, like you're going through the same thought process. So like for writing the cleaner math, it's easier to just say that sort of like the moment you succeed, then I query, where did you want to point like a split second ago? So that answered the question. Cool. So here the idea is that, again, the moment you create the block, or very, very literally before you even create the block, you have to decide, are you pointing to 2 or 4?
So basically the difference boils down to in proof of work, the act of finding the block determines both
Yeah.
the predecessor
Yeah.
and the
Yep.
the
Yep.
author of the block. Whereas in proof of stake, the system determines who the author is going to be, but the author still has agency.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's interesting. There's another question here I'm going to quickly answer. So the issue is that POS is internal pseudorandomness, or the issue is that the ordering is deterministic. So there's a question of, is the issue that it has internal pseudorandomness or that it's deterministic at the beginning of each epoch? So I would say definitely deterministic at the beginning of each epoch is one example of very high predictability. And so with that very high predictability, you can do, say, predictable selfish mining like I was describing, if it's a longest chain based one, or if it's not longest chain based, it just means you can, you know, every protocol is different. And knowing that you're the leader for 2 blocks in a row or 5 blocks in a row, knowing that that's going to happen in advance would let you do different things in different protocols. What we showed is that like, so I'll just like kind of quickly flash, mostly just to prove that like there is a formal definition. Where is it? Like, so this is a formal definition that's in the paper and basically says, if your proof of stake protocol is like this, then like, it doesn't have to be deterministic at the beginning of the epoch. It's just, if it's like this, then there's something clever that the miners can do because they can predict, they can just predict something in the future. And it's a little bit of a mouthful. So I think I want to just kind of refer to reading it in the paper and staring at it, or I can answer questions offline. But I would say the biggest thing is that it stems from there's an internal source of it stems from the fact that there's an internal source of randomness. Okay, so back to here, the idea is that right, so you have the flexibility that if instead what happened is you didn't find 2 blocks in a row, actually what happened is you hid your block and then someone else found a block and then you found the next block, then you're like, okay, right, because this happened, I'm definitely giving up on 2. But when I find my next block, I can just go back to regular selfish mining, and that's great. And so this is flexibility that you don't have in proof of work. So now the question is like, is this ever a useful thing to do? And it is a useful thing to do. And it's like a teeny bit more useful than regular selfish mining. So it's not obvious that the math was going to work out that way. But what we showed is that I would say the interesting thing is that, you know, 32.5 is less than 32.9. I don't think it's interesting by how much. But the other thing that's interesting is that, you know, again, 30.8, 31.8, like these are all, you know, just numbers, but it does mean that like, you're not all of a sudden getting down to this like X equals 0 range where now everyone can manipulate. So like, you still need to be big to manipulate. You don't need to be quite as big as in proof of work, but like, you know, so I would say like sort of like the incentive structure is similar to proof of work if you have your external beacon. But it is still, you know, like it is different. I think it's important to understand that there's a difference.
You have this image for like a knowledge of beacon?
So if there's no external beacon, then short of using like NPC or threshold signatures or something like that, that's what I would consider to be in this like X equals 0 range. So this is the short definition I flashed where like, basically it sounds like this. If a single miner, if you can look at a block and you as an individual miner, you can figure out when is the next timestamp where I'm eligible to mine on top of this block, and that's a computationally efficient process, then that's problematic. And the idea is just that when you have a block and you're thinking like, do I want to hide it or not? You just say, here's the process I do. Here's my block. I'm going to figure out when's the next time I'm eligible to produce a block on top of it. If that's soon, hide it. If it's not soon, don't.
So does this happen now?
No, well, so Ethereum is not proof of stake longest chain. So they're proof of stake with like leader selection and BFT protocols. And so sort of like, so the stuff I'm describing right now is longest chain proof of stake. So like in Ethereum, it wouldn't make sense to say, can I mine on top of this block? Because like there's this whole BFT, you know, thing going on. There's a different kind of So let me go into. Oh, let me just quickly say, I can share something on this, but if you guys haven't heard of this before, I thought this was so cool when I saw Aviv, I saw give a talk on this. Is it like there was detected timestamp manipulation on Ethereum, and this I would consider like selfish mining in the sense that it didn't violate consensus at all. It still functioned as normal. But someone was manipulating at the consensus level. They were winning tie breaks more often. Actually, it's weird. They were actually winning tie breaks more often by increasing the difficulty of their blocks, and that their difficulty adjustment algorithm was on a per block level. And so you could increase the difficulty of your block by pretending that you found it a little bit earlier. So what that means is that you throw it into the hash and you are less likely to succeed. But because uncles are very common in Ethereum, that being a little bit less likely to succeed, but way more likely to win a fork became profitable. And so then in their paper, they have this like super clear evidence that there's a pool that did this.
Was visiting ago.
Oh, okay, yeah. So anyways, yeah. So now you heard it twice, but so I'm not involved in this paper, but I thought this was super cool. And I think like totally motivates like motivates this kind of direction and stuff like this. Yeah.
I was not here like
Yeah.
I mainly saying that it was more profitable to lose than to win.
No, it was more profitable to win when there's a fork, but it was profitable to make it harder for you to find a block. I would say the naive. So when I first saw Aviv giving this talk, and I was like, oh, so you want to increase your timestamp. So like if you increase it to be a multiple of 9 instead of before, now it's easier for you to find a block. So you can lower your own difficulty. I was like, oh, that makes sense. And he's like, no, that's actually not what you do. He said there's too many orphans. And if you do that, you're going to lose a lot of tiebreakers. So what you should do instead is you should make it harder for yourself to find a block. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because, now like, you would have succeeded, but you have a risk of not succeeding. But that's actually more important because now you're going to win the ties when there's an uncle. So that was kind of cool. And I also, I don't know if he presented, but like, the guy just admitted it like immediately on Twitter too. So, okay, so let me do, so should I be wrapping up or?
We can move towards lunch.
Okay, cool. So, so to wrap up, so I'll again present like the lens I like to use is to look at the consensus protocol and just ask this question of sort of like, how big does at least one player need to be in order for it not to be a Nash equilibrium to follow the protocol? And I mentioned selfish mining. So through this lens, selfish mining says it's less than 50, but it's big. And I mentioned this work with Miriam about you can do it statistically undetectably. I briefly mention this work on like if you have an external randomness peak and it still fits into this category, that's it's definitely different than proof of work, but sort of like it has the same picture that you need to be very big to manipulate it. And I said there's all these other cases where even small people can profit by deviating. And I feel like that, to me, I feel like 0 versus non-zero, to me, seems like the bigger distinction. And so I mentioned these, if you, I mentioned you were asking, so I can tell you what kind of like goes into this leader manipulation in Byzantine consensus. It's similar to manipulating pseudo-randomness, but like it's definitely about manipulating pseudo-randomness, but the actual math looks different. And that is more relevant to Ethereum, I would say. Okay, and that's it. I guess when I presented this talk, I also, I forgot why I came up, but I wanted to just like share. I think MEV is super interesting. And I feel like the theme I'm learning is prior to going to this event where I kind of like learn more details about MEV, I thought like all the problems I just talked about, I think are like super hard. And then I learned about MEV and I was like, oh my God, like, like we'll solve all this stuff. Like, yeah, the EIP 1559 and it's like kind of addressing, and then sort of like MEV is like blowing everything up and like, you can have all this stuff done perfectly. And I don't know. So I feel like there's fortunately like a lot of hard problems left, which is good for me. I don't know. I guess good for you guys too, but
I mean,
so there's stuff to do.
He's an actual, like, normal, the other stuff, he's theoretical, no theoretical.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that stuff may be practical. This is happening.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So I think
Unfortunately, it also looks like it's coming to Bitcoin more with the BRC20 tokens and ordinals and CK rollups, whatever.
yeah.
There is not.
Yeah, so I think so. So I have basically I have 2 slides worth of thoughts on like why MEV is really hard. I have no, like for example, one thing I can just point out is that like MEV causes variance, and like that alone gives you all of the hardness with the transaction fees, which we also don't know how to solve, right? And then there's other stuff that like comes with it too. So basically, so I have formulated thoughts on like why it's so hard. I have 0 formulated thoughts on like what's the right thing to do from here. Yeah, but okay, so let me pause there.
Interesting things.
Yes. Yeah,
Thank you very
but
much.
yeah, thanks for having me.